Welcome back to Politics Nation. Republicans love to talk about out-of-control spending. Food stamps, out of control. Health care, beyond reason. But spending on the military, they have no problem with that. Take a look at this graphic. Last year, the United States spent $739 billion on defense. China, the country with the next largest military spending, spent just under $90 billion. Look at that, $739 billion compared to China's $90 billion. In fact, we spend more than the other top 10 countries combined by a long shot. So why is that important? The government is set up to automatically make defense cuts as part of last year's bipartisan budget agreement. And now the GOP is getting worried.
The cuts of this magnitude will put our nation's national security at risk.
The defense portion of the sequester, in my view, would clearly hollow our military.
We're finding the capability to address that threat's reduced.
There is no doubt we will have the smallest Navy and Air Force in history.
National security risk, hollow military, threats. Does this sound familiar? Oh, yes, it does. And they were in the mood for a little nostalgia, bringing Dick 13% Cheney in yesterday to get them gemmed up for the fight against these cuts. Wait, I'm sorry, did I say the GOP is against spending cuts? What about all this talk?
And the spending spree in Washington.
Focus on the issue of trying to get the fiscal house in order.
Washington has not gotten its fiscal house in order.
That's more like it. We need to get our fiscal house in order by cutting health care, by cutting the safety net. But apparently, that $739 billion on military spending, that's just okie dokie, archie-coachie. Joining me now is Congressman Barney Frank, Democrat from Massachusetts. Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Will.
You've been a leader in the fight against the ballooning military budget for years. They'll cut health care, they'll cut social programs, food stamps. Why is military spending off limits?
Well, it's part of an ideology. Part of it, look, let's be clear. When you have the Tea Party types in power, when you have these right-wingers in power, they're not just cutting Medicare because they need to reduce the deficit. They were against Medicare when it started. These are people who do not understand that we need a private sector that is vigorous, but a public sector that's also well-funded and active. They are opposed to the notion of governance. They don't understand it. As to the military, they have this ideology that says America somehow has this mission. Some of them say it's God's idea, a terrible thing to blame God for, it seems to me. But it's God's idea that America has to bring peace and order to the whole world. Well, for one thing, we simply physically and even more culturally can't do it. You know, the military is very good. We have a superb military. They are very good at what a military can do. They can stop bad things from happening. But the best trained, best armed 30-year-old Americans can't make democracy happen in Iraq. They can't make corruption go away in Afghanistan. They cannot bring cohesion to a society that doesn't have it, but we spend tens and hundreds of billions trying. And the particular hypocrisy, and you nailed it very well, Al, when you talk about laying off teachers, when you talk about reducing police officers, when you talk about not building highways, when you talk about not having housing for the elderly, they say that's a good thing because they say when the government spends money, it hurts the economy, it detracts from the private economy. They think John Maynard Keynes, who said sometimes government spending is necessary to get out of an economic slough, that's wrong. But when it comes to the military, it's a mysterious thing to me. Apparently, everything they believe about government spending flips, and they are worried that we'll have a recession if we cut the military. By the way, I want to cut the military in some places where it isn't going to cost us a recession. We continue, 65 years after World War II, 67 years, to be the main defense budget for France, for Germany, for England, for Italy. You know, we did that under Harry Truman when the communists were threatening the poor, weak nations of Western Europe, we're still doing it. So in France, they're proposing to lower the retirement age for some people from 62 to 60, while these Republicans want to raise our retirement age to 70. And, of course, the reason the French can afford it is we're subsidizing their military.
Under this budget. And when you raise about what they're doing in terms of the budget and the priorities, Republicans have bought wholeheartedly into this Ryan budget. And it's devastating to the poor. Remember, 62% of the cuts target low-income programs. That's $3.3 trillion in cuts. Yet the budget boosts defense spending. Yes. It increases it by $6.2 trillion in this decade.
Yeah,
it's amazing what they're proposing.
I don't like the sequester. That's not the right way to do it. I don't want to cut across the board. I want to cut substantially the thermonuclear weapons we still have stockpiled so we can win a thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union, which we don't have to worry about anymore. We don't need to be defending Western Europe. Yeah, I worry about Iran. I worry about some other things. I want America to be the strongest nation in the world, mainly because Denmark can't handle it, and I'd rather it be us than China. But we can be the strongest nation in the world at about 75% of what we're now spending. And, of course, it's a zero-sum game. If you're going to reduce the deficit, if you don't cut medical care, and you're right about what it does to the most vulnerable. But let's not forget, it whacks the middle class pretty good, too. It cuts back on roads. It cuts back on firefighters. It cuts back on environmental protection. All of the things we do together, which is what government does, to improve the quality of our lives here, gets cut savagely so we can continue to waste money in Afghanistan, subsidize Western Europe, and be prepared for an all-out thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union.
So I'm glad you made that clear. So you're talking about the Western Europe subsidies. You're talking about Afghanistan. You're talking about things that will not at all lead to any risk for American citizens.
No risk for American citizens, and in most cases, very little economic negatives for Americans. I don't see how if we still have Marines on Okinawa. I think most people thought when John Wayne died, the Marines left, although he was never actually himself in the military. If we were to take those thousands of Marines off Okinawa, which the Okinawans would like us to do, it would help the American economy, not hurt it.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you about Mitt Romney. You've represented Massachusetts since the 80s, so you know Mr. Romney pretty well. Why won't he release his tax returns?
Oh, for a very good reason. He's embarrassed about what they would show. They would show that this is a man who took advantage of every loophole, of everything that's unpopular about the tax code, who had no regard for the American economy, but to the extent that he could outsource, the president says he's outsourcing jobs. Well, he's consistent. He outsourced his own income production. Clearly, he would be embarrassed by the extent to which he had not just a lot of money. That's not the issue. It is where he had it in these tax havens, in places that any American president ought to want to try to change.
Do you think with the growing chorus that we're hearing from members of his own party that he may have to defer and release more information? Or from what you know of him, do you think he's going to hold his line?
I don't see, well, first place, when you say hold the line, if Romney holds the line on this, it will be the first time in the man's life that he's held the line on anything. There is nothing more dangerous than to be between Mitt Romney and a position he used to have and a position that is politically more advantageous. You get run over by one of his wife's two Cadillacs. The fact is that this is a man who is the most flexible guy, and yes, he's embarrassed. This is a purely political calculation. I don't see how you can sustain money for president while hiding the things that he did. And again, it's not an attack on the wealthy. It's an attack on someone, first of all, who clearly was misleading about his role in Bain. I was very struck by your segment with the guy from the Phoenix. I'm very proud to come from the era where the Boston Phoenix got its start, and I was around when it did, where by coincidence, Romney and Bain happened to be making the same parallel investment at a time when he theoretically had nothing to do with Bain. That's a heck of a coincidence. Very interesting. And
Chairman,
this is a man who's got a lot to hide, and he's hiding it.
Well, Chairman, I've got to go. Chairman Bonnie Frank, thanks as always. Great guest. Thank you for coming. Coming up, big news about Chris Christie in 2012. but not the kind his fans have been hoping for. It left us wondering if there's a new rift in the GOP. Plus, Rush Limbaugh responds to critics of his wacky Batman-Bane conspiracy theory. And beer, cans, boats, sharks, and tattoos. Your summer break is straight ahead.